Coming together against one-man rule, Egypt's opposition leaders reject a move in parliament to extend presidential terms. Nearly 6 years after the military coup that brought him to power, will Abdel Fattah el-Sisi ever leave office? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. There is alarm in Egypt today over proposed changes to the constitution. They could allow the president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, to stay in office until 2034. Now that's well after the official end of his second term in 2022. Opposition leaders are rallying against the changes to stop what some are calling an Arab Spring in reverse. Hashim Al-Bara sets up our discussion.
Its supporters say it's a crucial step to ensure stability. Opponents, though, fear their country is moving towards autocracy. Egypt seems divided over a package of amendments introduced and approved by a pro-government bloc in parliament. The changes extend presidential term limits to 6 years instead of 4, specifically mentioning the current leader Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, but they have to be approved by parliament and put to a referendum. If the amendments get a yes vote, it could pave the way for President Sisi to stay in power until 2034.
In 1976, Egyptian President Mohamad Elmasry amended the 1971 constitution due to the war. We are going through a war that is more intense. The war in Sinai and the wars we are facing by other countries that I would like not to name.
But the opposition is trying to rally support to block the changes. President Sisi, who came to power in a military coup, is serving his second and last term as per the 2014 constitution, which clearly states that he cannot run for office after his term ends in 2022.
The transfer of power is a moral principle which was created by the revolutions of the 25th of January and the 30th of June. It's not allowed to tamper with this moral principle, or else we'll be in a position that will cause the Egyptian people to remain with no morals or preservation of the principles.
Sisi's supporters have also introduced new changes, creating the post of vice president, reintroducing a second chamber of parliament and giving minorities a bigger say. The changes are likely to be approved by the parliament, where Sisi supporters have an absolute majority. But it's the referendum that will be a test of the president's popularity. Human rights groups, though, are concerned about what they say is a widespread crackdown on dissent and arbitrary mass trials of President Sisi's opponents. Hashim Al-Bara for Inside Story.
We have a lot to get through with our guests in just a moment, but first the outcry on social media. Many Egyptians are criticising the proposed changes to the constitution. Among them, Mohamad Elmasry, the former interim vice president who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2005. Now he's on Twitter today and I quote, "Project to amend #Egypt Constitution unfolding and in full throttle. Main features: extending presidential term limit, diminishing judicial independence, and anointing military as the guardian of the state. Arab Spring in reverse." Okay, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Cairo on Skype today is Timothy Kaldas, a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Here in Doha is Mohamad Elmasry, associate professor and chair of the journalism program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And in Brussels, James Moran, associate senior research fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies and a former ambassador to Egypt, Jordan and Yemen. Thank you to you all for joining us here on Inside Story. Timothy Kaldas in Cairo first. These proposed changes, what do they mean?
Well, they're an effort to both expand and consolidate Sisi's rule over Egypt, which is a project that's been underway since he came onto the scene and became president in 2014. We've seen that with legislative efforts to expand his control over judicial appointments. Now they're trying to embody those efforts in the Constitution. We're seeing the addition of another upper house of parliament of which a third of the members will be appointed by the president, again, increasing his power over that body. He'll also have more control over the choosing of the selection of the public prosecutor. So there's a variety of mechanisms here to expand his control of various state institutions while simultaneously extending his rule potentially until 2034.
Mohamad Elmasry here in Doha. The opposition, how much real power do they have?
I think we have to be really careful when we talk about Egyptian opposition. I don't personally like that term. All serious opposition to military rule in Egypt was effectively eliminated during a campaign of eliminationism in 2013 and 2014. We saw the elimination of political parties, mass killings, mass arrests of political leaders, mass death sentences, draconian legislation, and terrorism designations. So there is no serious substantive political opposition in Egypt. We have a watered down opposition, if you will. They are very weak. That is by design. It's very unlikely that their movement inside of parliament will generate any steam. Reports suggest that there's already a supermajority in support of these proposed amendments. And ultimately, this will go to a referendum, which will be controlled by the state, as all other elections and referenda have been during the Sisi period or the Sisi era. And we'll see the yes vote win out in a landslide election, which will be decried as a sham by analysts and scholars and human rights groups.
James Moran, to listen to Mohamad Elmasry there, it looks like we're on the road to more El-Sisi. As far as the European Union is concerned, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, let me just say, when this constitution of 2014 was promulgated, I was the EU ambassador there in Cairo. I remember well it was welcomed in the international community pretty widely as being just about the most positive thing to come out of all the turmoil between 2011 and 2013-14. And there were high hopes for this constitution. Why? Because for the first time, I think, in modern times, it looked on paper that it was going to provide proper checks and balances against authoritarian presidential rule. It also took care to a much greater extent than previous constitutions of individual rights and freedoms. It wasn't perfect, but it was a pretty good outcome. Now, with the changes coming, I would be a little bit worried about the medium term, because Egypt has been down this path before of presidential rule in the era, notably, of Hosni Mubarak. And look what happened. If it's about stability, you have to ask the question, is this really in the best interest of the country to make these sorts of changes? Because they will certainly erode in a pretty fundamental way all those checks and balances that the 2014 constitution was trying to introduce.
Timothy Caldas, from where you are in Cairo, we're talking here about a grouping of, 10 or 11 political parties. What are the chances they get support across the country?
I don't think that the focus should be on the political parties. Mohamad's correct in the sense that the opposition within parliament itself is quite limited. And they don't have the votes really to do much in terms of stopping the referendum, stopping the amendments to move to referendum. There are a number of civil society and human rights groups that have called on Egyptians to vote no. And what is somewhat unique about this, I don't disagree that ultimately the government will almost certainly get the result it wants regardless of public opinion. But it is an interesting moment in the sense that, unlike past elections where the president could imprison or drive out of the race through intimidation any of the candidates, the word no is not something he can lock up. And so Egyptians actually will get to vote against President Sisi's continuation for the first time effectively. And whether or not that vote gets recorded and publicized, if people actually go out and do it, people within the regime will know that that happened. And that could affect his position internally. But I think it's almost inevitable that the amendments will eventually come into force, unfortunately.
Mohamad Elmasry in Doha, what's your reaction to the logic here that says, well, we've got to push through with these changes because what he wants to do with the economy, what he wants to do to turn the country around, he's hampered by the Constitution as it stands today?
None of this is surprising, right? This is a continuation of what we've seen post 2013. I was on Al-Jazeera and writing on Al-Jazeera in 2014 about this inevitability, that this was going to come. There were whispers back in 2014 that Sisi would need to have a prolonged, extended stay in power. This is what Egypt's deep state wants. They want a strong man. They believe that this will help preserve their interests. Allies in the region like this because they believe that it brings creates and sustains stability, which is what they want. So all of this, all of these justifications, as far as I'm concerned, as somebody who supports democracy, are absurd. What Egypt needs is a legitimate democratic transformation. It needs sharing of power. It needs balance of power, checks and balances, the kinds of things that the other guests have been talking about. I also want to note that in my estimation, and again, a lot of people wrote about this back in 2014, but the 2014 Constitution was not really a way forward. The 2012 Constitution was also flawed, but the 2014 Constitution represented actually a step backwards, a step closer toward authoritarianism.
James Moran in Brussels. Is the opposition here, was their betting essentially flawed? Were they betting that after the last election, 97% in his favour on a very low turnout, just over 40%, but was the opposition then betting that once he'd won, or they would say once he cooked the books, if you will, he would then soften his stance? But he hasn't softened his stance, so them rising up with this opposition amendment plan is actually a reaction to that.
Well, that's possible. It's difficult to know. On the opposition, I think it's not just about parties in parliament. There are very small parties, of course, the Conservatives, Tagamu and a couple of the others, but between them they must have only about 20-odd MPs. But there is also in civil society a couple of movements that have been announced. One of them took my attention the other day, the Union for the Protection of the Constitution, which I think has signed up with a number of prominent personalities in the country, including Mohamad Elmasry and some other politicians. So civil society, I think, is going to be working to do what it can on opposition, although I must say I kind of agree with the other guests. The prospects for success have got to be considered fairly dim. One other thing, the president did say on more than one occasion, I think most recently even last year, that he had no intention of changing the Constitution or serving a term out beyond what was actually in the 2014 Constitution. I can't, by the way, agree with your previous guest when he compares it to the 2012 document, but let's put that on one side. But the president did say that. Now, I wonder, with that in mind, of course, this all has to go to the president at some stage in the parliamentary process. It'll be interesting to see how he reacts to the report that will come from the parliament proposing these amendments when he has to sign off before the referendum is taking place. It'll be very interesting to see how he explains that, because he has been very clear since he came into power that he was going not to change the Constitution, that he was going to stick to the two terms as laid down at 2014.
Timothy Caldis, give us a sense of how people perceive him there in Egypt. Some of his critics say he's actually worse than Mubarak. The military and the people that have run Egypt have come from the military on so many different occasions. If you put him in the gamut, the range of past presidents, where would you sit him?
I mean, he's undeniably the most repressive person to lead Egypt in its modern history. It's not even, I mean, it's not really debatable. But to be fair, on Ambassador Moran's point, he also promised in 2013 not to run for president at all. So, I mean, him breaking his word in terms of extending his rule and control over the country is hardly surprising. And on the constitutional debate, I mean, they're both pretty bad documents that have poor checks and balances built into them. I think that fundamentally the population's approval of Sisi has been in decline for a number of years due to the deteriorating economic situation for most. Their purchasing power has collapsed since the currency collapsed. Inflation has been at record levels. It's starting to come down now, but for quite some time, we're hitting 30+%. So people have been struggling for quite a long time, and Sisi's been promising that there will be some sort of respite from this, but they haven't really been feeling it. And with the anticipated further reduction of fuel subsidies that should be coming into effect this year, it will continue to give momentum to the inflationary challenges that the country already faces.
Mohamad Elmasry, why has the outside world been relatively quiet about him being in the top job and how he does it when he occupies that office? Because, you know, Hosni Mubarak was there for a long time. He was kind of normalized. There was a distinct sense with him latterly, before the Arab Spring. There was a sense that, yes, we can work with him. I'm thinking about the relationship with the United States, peace in the Middle East, the Palestinian territories, etc. But with El-Sisi, the sense, the feeling is something different.
Yeah, well, when you say the outside world, I mean, it really depends on who you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other allies in the Arab region, it's pretty clear why they want the Egyptian military establishment to remain strong and to remain powerful. They're opposed to any sort of democratic movement or momentum in the area because they're scared about their own holds over power. In terms of the West, I think that Western governments have made some strategic miscalculations. You know, the Obama administration had a brief window of opportunity in 2013 to simply declare what happened in Egypt a military coup d'etat, which would have then forced the United States out of its funding relationship with the Egyptian military. The U.S. would have been forced by American law to stop funding the Egyptian military. The Obama administration opted to continue its relationship, and it's been more or less business as usual. And I think the reason, I don't agree with it, but I think the reason why is they perceive Sisi and other authoritarian leaders to be capable of bringing about the kind of long-term stability in the region that they desire, and being able to more broadly help achieve American and other Western strategic interests. I think that's a miscalculation for many reasons, but if you look at the last 5 years, and I think Timothy was speaking to this, there's been more instability in Egypt over the last 5 years post-coup than at any other time in Egypt's modern history. There have been more terrorist attacks, more violence by vigilante groups and also by the state than at any other point in time. So Sisi has failed on that front. He's failed on the economic front, as Timothy was also speaking to, and in other areas as well.
James, in Brussels, clearly he's a clever guy, but does he know that his popularity is waning? There's the issue of the two islands that he has in effect gifted to Saudi Arabia. The austerity message is not popular at all across the country, and the economy is not flatlining, but it's going down the way.
Well, yes, certainly. I mean, the popularity had to come down from the stratospheric heights that he enjoyed 2 or 3 years ago. But on the economy, here I'm going to have to disagree with the previous speaker. I think that's an area where there have been developments. I'm not saying that's necessarily because of the type of governance that Egypt's had over the last 2 or 3 years. It's to do with many other things. But I point to, they've been lucky. There have been major gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, which will make a big difference to the country in the next 10, 20 years. They have had a fairly successful IMF program in place for the last 2 or 3 years. I know it's blamed to some extent for the inflation of a couple of years ago, and people continue to look upon it critically, but it has made some difference. And on the fuel subsidy, frankly speaking, that's good riddance to it. Most of the people that benefited from the fuel subsidy were the rich, the elite, and diplomats like I was. I mean, we used to pay a pittance for our petrol. It was quite scandalous that this was the case. And the fuel subsidy, frankly speaking, was really doing nothing for the poor and the unemployed in the country. Now, the country does have an opportunity ahead of it in the next few years to actually develop reasonably well. Forecasts are showing 5% plus growth. It's not brilliant, but it's not bad. Unemployment has come down just a tick in the last 12 months. There is a possibility of going forward here. But I wonder whether these amendments in the Constitution will really help that. I don't think so. They talk about stability. Well, stability, fine. But if you're going to have a situation where you don't have a good dialogue between the different sectors of society, not least the business elite and the governed and the governance, and if you're going to have difficulties with military involvement in the economy, which of course is another issue which has come to the fore in the last couple of years, you're going to have difficulty at the end of the day in raising the Egyptian economy's competitiveness and sustainability in the longer term.
Okay. James, just let me interrupt you there, because we are getting towards the end of the programme, and I do want to hit a couple of final points. First point to you, Mohamad Elmasry, here in Doha. Fast forward, 2034, and we've had El-Sisi in power for all those years. would you recognize Egypt then compared to what it is today?
Egypt's been more or less the same authoritarian state for the better part of 60 years. So I guess yes. I would expect also if he's still alive in 2034 that there would be another amendment to give him a lifetime lifetime rule. Very briefly, if I may, this idea that Sisi's popularity was at stratospheric heights back a few years ago is not really accurate. The only opinion polling data that we have, scientific opinion polling data that we have from 2013 at his height is from Zogby and Pew, and they both put his popularity, his approval rating at about 50%, which was about the same as the president that he ousted, Mohamad Morsi. And on the economy, quickly, it's true that some of the macro level measures show that Egypt has improved. But at the micro level, which is what Timothy was speaking about, for the average Egyptian, things have become almost unbearable.
Timothy Kaldas in Cairo, are we also saying that his true ability to carry on as president of Egypt really comes down to three things, I guess? Trump's patronage, because you already talked about the US administration, and also the American and the Israeli belief that he can keep a lid on the country, because that's got to be a mirroring function of their strategic interests in the region.
I don't think I would limit his longevity to external support. There's a lot of internal variables within the government and the different centers of power within the regime and how everything gets negotiated. He has been very effective at consolidating that power and putting loyalists in very powerful positions, such as Minister of Defense, head of the intelligence services, et cetera. That said, I would also expand the pool of external support to Europe. Europe has basically concluded that if Sisi is useful to them or supportive to their agenda of preventing migration from Egypt, then his other crimes can be overlooked. And while they might make comments about them in press conferences, it doesn't affect the material relationship, whether it be related to arms sales or other trade deals. The reality is that the President Sisi is seen as the devil they know and one that they can do business with, and they have.
James Moran in Brussels. Is there also a chance here that he might react in the worst possible way if he thinks his potential problems are mounting and increasing exponentially?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. React against whom?
React against the people, react against other politicians. He is known as being very, very authoritarianism.
I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. My feeling, having returned to Egypt a number of times since being their resident, is that there's a certain fatalism in the country about what is to come in the years ahead. There is also still a worry, I think, in the general population about the return of instability in the streets. Whilst his popularity, certainly, whichever figures we take, his popularity is nowhere near what it used to be when he first came in. There is a lack, for the time being, of a credible alternative leadership. That is partly explained, of course, by the policies of the regime itself in terms of oppression and so on. But I think for the next few years, he is relatively secure, and I don't think we're going to see any great civil unrest from either side in the years to come. What I really worry about here is that this constitutional amendment process is basically throwing what's left of the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the more positive changes that came after the revolution of 2011. Okay. And that is a great pity and a great shame.
I just want to put the last point of the programme to Timothy Kaldas in Cairo. You're there, Timothy, ground zero. Have we been asking the wrong question on the programme today? Should the question really have been, when is the next revolution coming in Egypt? And I'm asking that quite seriously because it occurs to me that, you know, Mohammed was saying basically we've had military dictatorship or something thereof or close to that for the past, 55, 60 years. But Timothy, should the question be, it's all going to change, but we just can't anticipate when?
I don't think that we have a realistic way of predicting that. And it gets asked a lot. I think every time there's a little bit of unrest, there's a little bit of activity, people jump to conclusions grounded largely in wishful thinking about what it might mean. I mean, when there were reshuffles of the security apparatus a year ago and Sisi was replacing the defense minister and the head of intelligence, people thought that, oh, there's turmoil in the regime and Sisi's weakened. In reality, he consolidated his power very effectively without any consequences, managed to put his loyalists in these extremely powerful positions and lock up the former head of the armed forces in 72 hours. So, I mean, and he's clearly sticking around. Is it possible that people will reach a breaking point given all the economic pressure they're under? Sure. Is there any sense of inevitability on that front? I don't think so. I mean, also keep in mind that from the perspective of most Egyptians, they've overthrown two governments in the last several years, and their lives have more or less gotten economically worse after each instance of that. So there's also limited faith in the ability of an uprising to deliver positive change. And convincing them otherwise is going to be part of the challenge going forward should they seek to try to bring an end to this authoritarian rule.
Gentlemen, we must leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Timothy Kaldas, Mohamad Elmasry and James Moran. And thank you to you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter @AJ Inside Story, or I'm @PeterDobby1. From me, Peter Dobby, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll do it all again this time tomorrow. Bye-bye.